Hi, guys. Welcome to the Church Split. My name is Will, and today we are talking about, once again, the Alex O'Connor versus 21 Christians episode of Jubilee. But today I am not talking about this alone. I actually have a good friend of mine now, Than Christopoulos, with me. You might recognize him as the guy with an awesome mustache and a floral shirt from the video. He actually got to talk to Alex about the resurrection and about Christology. So I'm excited to have Than on to talk about this. But first, guys, don't forget to do the liking and the subscribing and all the things, because that makes things a lot easier and a lot of fun. And also, if you guys would like to order the book and all that, all in the links in the description below. But Than, how are you doing today?
I'm doing awesome, man. I appreciate the appreciation of my outfit, by the way. One of the first texts I got from a friend when the Jubilee video released was a picture of me with the caption, "Christian destroys atheist with immaculate drip."
That's fantastic. No, right when I was like, ooh, the mustache, I too like to live boldly. Of course,
The only reason I don't have it now is because I sneezed while shaving. So,
oh, would do it. So anyway, Than, I know I'm friends with you online. I saw you prepping to go to Jubilee for a little while and to do this episode. So we do have some clips pulled up of your interaction with Alex. The reason why I wanted to have you on was, one, because it's the new thing that people are talking about, so of course I have to talk about it.
yeah.
But also because there's so many things that you were doing, and I was so excited for them, and you didn't get a chance to completely unpack them, and I was like, I want Than to have that chance. So
Yeah.
I wanted to have you on here for people who are maybe kind of lost when they listen to your section, because I mentioned in my video, kind of hyping this up, so to speak, which is you have a very sophisticated approach, but not everyone is familiar with the sophisticated approach that you take when it comes to defending the resurrection and even high Christology. So I'd love to talk about that for a little bit here. Now, real quick though, what was your experience with Jubilee? How did you feel about that whole thing? Were you happy with the event? Go ahead and tell us what you're able to tell us about it.
Yeah. So I'll start here. I loved working with Jubilee. Like, their communication with us was on point, super hospitable. Something people don't know. I'll I think I'll do it. I'm a tough guy, okay? I was definitely sick during this recording. Like, Tim Howard was on there. He's one of my best friends. Him and I actually have like both developed together our approach to the problem of evil and everything. And so we stayed together, and he'll tell you himself, like, driving home to the hotel the night before after dinner, he looked at me and he's like, "I thought you were dying." Like, I told him, like, "Don't talk to me, just drop me off at the hotel, let me go to sleep," kind of a thing. Like, I was struggling that day. And that, to tie that back to Jubilee, they didn't want us having like branded drinks or anything like that on set. And I was like, "Look, I'm just really sick. If you guys want me to leave, I get it, but I just need all these Gatorades with me." And I'm like, "Do you want us to like run out and get some more for you? Like, you're good. What do you need from us?" So they were super cool. I loved being on there, all that stuff. The format, it was incredibly difficult. I'm not going to complain about that. That I knew what I was getting myself into.
Mm-hmm.
There's obviously, I wish I could have gotten out more. I wish I would have had more time with Alex. And it was harder than I imagined as well. Like, you can prep for it mentally all you want, but then when you're sitting there in the chair, you have the timer in front of you and your peripherals, you have flags going up, and Alex is interrupting you, but you have to like interrupt him to get back to the point because there's so much like happening at the same time, and you only have so much time left. Man, that was tough.
Yeah, and you've also, I mean, you're not a stranger to this sort of like to debating somebody. You also debated Matt Dillahunty not that long ago. So
Well, yeah, that was my first like real debate was
right.
with Matt. I'm not a good debater. I don't really know how to use rhetoric or anything like that. So
That's why you're friends with me now. I'll
yeah,
tell me all the
I
time I'm
need
too
all the
polemical.
coaching I can get in that regard. Because if you can tell, like, I don't know how to do that kind of stuff.
I actually thought you performed extremely well with Matt Dillahunty, to the point where I was like philosophically wrecked, but I'm not sure if Matt knows that. But but it was like really good. Actually, a friend of mine, because of the video I talked about leading up to this, actually texted me this morning and said he watched the debate and said it went really well and you were really, really nice.
I would like to attribute a lot of the success of the Dillahunty debate to the fact that him and I got along really well.
Hmm.
Like, laying my cards on the table, I think I gave Matt tons of rhetorical opportunities to smoke me if he really wanted to, and he chose not to. I think he took it easy on me rhetorically because I think he just likes me. Um, I'm just being honest there, laying my
Yeah.
cards on the table.
Well, it helps that you're a likable guy. So now so that's great. So Jubilee was very hospitable, and I felt like the format is clearly designed for more entertainment purposes, right? I mean, that's kind of thing. You're watching this 21 people go against this one guy, and
Yeah.
it's lightning quick. I mean, I even thought like as soon as red flags go up, I'm like that would be so. I was trying to put myself in that situation where it'd be so hard to focus in front of me when I'm seeing this boop, and then right behind
Yeah.
him another flag go up or like off in your peripheral, and straight up like right when even someone had mentioned like you make your first argument, and I saw a flag go up, and I was like, "Shut up, sit down, and let my boy cook." Anyway, so that's really good. That's really interesting. I've thought about doing it before. I put in an application. Like they send me now updates on things I can apply for to join.
Yeah.
Maybe one day I will, just for kicks and giggles. But otherwise, Alex is obviously known to be a very polite thinker and an engager. Now, I'm not sure if I've kind of gotten past the point I mentioned in my last video where I'm past the point of thinking of him as like a man. I thought he was like top tier. I'm kind of at the point where I'm like, I feel like we get really dodgy sometimes with the evidence, but that's my beef, not yours. But he is a really polite guy. You're polite. I really enjoyed you guys' exchange. Now, when it comes to this, we do actually have some of the videos pulled up. But before I pull up the video of your particular exchange, you didn't really get a chance to talk about the problem of evil, specifically animal suffering.
Mhm.
And that's like Alex's. And actually, I think this is a good argument that atheists
Yeah.
have started latching onto. It's one of those ones where I think actually they bring up good points because he's not talking about moral agents. So then, therefore, why do animals suffer if they're moral agents? Like you get he basically acknowledges all the theodicies that Christianity uses can maybe get you out of the problem with moral agents, but the animal suffering he talks about specifically. Do you actually have any thoughts on the problem of animal suffering?
Yeah. So if you listened to Tim Howard's exchange with Alex there, him and I have, save for a few stylistic differences and maybe just a few different principles that are like inside of our arguments, we have the exact same approach to the problem of animal suffering. And for the problem of evil in general. So the long story short is, here's the basic version, and if you want me to expand from here, I can kind of build it out. Um, w- One thing I'm going to point to is the fact that most people that make an argument from suffering in general, right? They'll assume something called, and you'll probably remember this from the discussion with Tim too. They'll assume something called a necessity condition, um, which is this basic thesis that says like God is only justified on allowing any. Um, do you know? Do you and your audience know what like a type token distinction is in philosophy?
Uh, Man, I know I've read that before, but I can't pull it off from the top of my head. So
No,
go
no, no
ahead.
problem. So when I say type token, a type is going to be like a generic category of something, and a token is going to be like a particular instantiation. So like,
Okay. That was what my brain was going. I'm like, is that kind of,
yeah.
but
So
I
like a
couldn't
phone is a
recall.
type, but like this is a token, right? Kind of a
Yes.
thing. So for God to be justified in allowing any token of suffering, that token has to be necessary for the greater goods that that token brings about. That's the only way it's going to be justified. Tim and I reject that, and we're going to instead adopt what I think is both philosophically, experientially, and biblically supported, which is the defeat condition, which is something's going to be justified in being allowed if that event is intrinsically redeemable, or like a type of event that the agent can look back on and then assess their whole life on the whole and still say my life on the whole was worth living, if that
Yes.
makes sense.
Yep.
And so that's a really important distinction, because then what the atheist has to do is point to an event that not just in this side of the life, but also eschatologically or in heaven, is the type of event that no matter what, the agent can never, ever look back and subjectively think my life is on the whole worth living. And I would also add in that like God did not give and that agent adequate opportunity to experience the defeat of that particular instance of suffering. Um, so that's like one puzzle piece. The next puzzle piece then is just going to be the fact that I think, and Tim does too, that animals will be universally redeemed. And you can kind of point to tons of places in scripture to motivate this. All of creation is groaning for redemption, all this other stuff, right? There's philosophical, like independent arguments that you can get there from like base theism to animal redemption.
Yep.
And then from there, it's kind of like open to what you think is the most plausible. Um, I actually opt for more of like an animal theosis type idea where animals will be granted some sort of rationality where like their meaning making capabilities, which I actually think they have in the first place, just not to the same extent as humans, um, will be on a higher level to be closer to the type of meaning making that humans can find. And so I think all animals will universally endorse retroactively the type of life that they've lived and the place they had in the whole cosmic story of reality. Um, and God will deem them praiseworthy for their place, and they will they will endorse the life they've lived and be happy to have lived, if that makes sense. That's the
Yeah, I
long
know.
story short.
I would agree with that. There's actually a great book for people who would be interested on more of this called The Problem of Animal Pain by Trent Doherty.
Yes.
And he discusses that very thing, the redemption model. And what's interesting about it is that because there are so many places in scripture that actually seems to refer to the fact that all of creation will be restored, and it never seems to exclude animal suffering. And then the other thing is sometimes people are like, yeah, but animals don't have a soul, so therefore they're not. But the word actually in Hebrew is nefesh. Like it says, it refers to animals as having some sort of soul, which is also why, if they die, you also see the light go out from their eyes. So
Yeah, there's also, let me pull something up quick. You also just have like weird verses, like it's in Genesis 9, I think. Let me pull it up. Yeah, like Genesis 9, 5-6 talks about animals having to give an account to God if they kill a person and stuff like that. You can't tell me the ancient authors didn't view animals in such a way. It's incredibly bizarre to me that a lot of these assumptions about animals get imported into these atheistic arguments, because on top of that, right, it doesn't really matter what the atheist thinks about animal souls and all this other stuff, if they believe they have souls, if they'll be redeemed or anything like that. 'Cause at the end of the day, to falsify the Christian model that any particular Christian holds to, because Christianity is not a monolith, right? You're going to have to adopt the theology of the Christian you're talking to and falsify that interconnected framework, not the straw man that you've built up that you can easily take down.
Absolutely. And then this actually goes into, you and I talked about this pre-show, and then we can go ahead and go into the clips. But one of the things that you and I talked about pre-show is also a great apologetic. Now, some people are like, I have a hard time remembering what did Philo say and all these other interconnected data points to defend the resurrection. And then, okay, now from that, all the different philosophical arguments for theism. And some people can be almost overwhelmed with that. And what I tell people regularly as well, I'm like, if you have a hard time doing that, then just be good at remembering different ideas within Christian theology, because a good theology is actually very hard to knock down, because a lot of atheism deals with internal critiques of the Christian worldview. And if it's an internal critique, but you have a really good idea of theology, then you'll be just fine. So that's why apologetics is multiple things. There's arguments for the resurrection, arguments for the existence of God, and arguments for good theology. And I think if you have all those things put together, you're going to do pretty okay. So that's why there's different. People should notice that people like N.T. Wright, not an apologist by trade, but a lot of people be like, he brought me to God, is because a lot of their objections to God was because they may have had a wrong understanding of something, and now they have a clearer understanding of something. So,
no, 100%. That's the one of my favorite times when I'm like arguing with somebody that's an atheist is when they make an argument that's like projected towards some sort of aspect of theology that I just don't hold to, and I could just go, yeah, I don't believe that.
Yeah, same thing. I'm like, yeah, I'm with you. I don't agree with that. And yes, I love doing that too. Where I'm just like, people. Yeah, my eschatology, even my favorite one is, obviously, people know I'm not penal substitutioning guy, and so some people will object with that in frame, like, cool, I don't agree with that. They're like, "Oh." I'm like, yep, that's right. Anyway, so what I have here, so I have your first interaction with Alex and Than. Whenever you want me to pause the video, just go ahead and ask, because I'm more than happy to do it.
Okay.
But this stuff is happening fast, and what
Yeah.
people need to understand is the arguments for the resurrection, especially your particular model that you're going with, is more complex, but it's also more sophisticated in that sense. It becomes a lot more difficult epistemologically to knock down than people might think.
Yeah. I'll also add this in really quick, and I've talked with Eric about this a little bit, and I'm still building this out more. I don't take my approach to the maximalist case for the resurrection is a little different compared to the typical McGroupie, McPologist, whatever you want to call us. Because typically it's like a two-stage argument. I actually kind of break this down into even multiple stages if I have the time. Um, and I can get into that if you want, but the basic idea is like the very first thing I do is I actually just establish the historical reportage model of the Gospels and I outline its predictions. Then I give arguments for the historical reportage model. From there, I go into arguments for the reliability of the Gospels and Acts by pointing to like onomastic congruence, the geographical accuracies, undesigned, like all that other stuff, unexplained illusions. But the
Hmm.
case. Then I go to extracting the testimony. Then I do the the standard Bayesian stuff. And then if I have time from there, I actually add in like two different types of arguments. One is going to be like a priori arguments for why the prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus is not going to be insanely low. And I also tack on arguments from modern day miracles done in Jesus' name, and whether somebody wants to treat that as evidence to take on to in the posterior or include in the priors doesn't really matter to me, because the basic idea is if Jesus is dead, modern day miracles done in Jesus' name that I think are authentic and have passed like super inscrutable criteria, those things are going to be like really surprising if he's dead, but really
Hmm.
expected if he's alive.
Okay, so some of you might not have actually watched my previous video when I kind of did a reaction video and a quick thought process on my thought with Than and Alex O'Connor. But for those who did watch it, this might be a review. Those who did not watch it, let me go ahead and explain some of the lingo that Than may have been using, because he mentioned like not changing facts. I think some people would be like, what is he even talking about here? So here's the reality. There are, in the New Testament scholarship world of apologetics and the nerd like vacuum that this is, there are two major views. There is one that's popularized by people like Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. Mike Licona, what we would call not just the minimal facts approach to the resurrection, but they also defend the historicity of the Gospels using what we call literary devices. In other words, any of the differences between the Gospels can be explained with what we call a literary device that they might augment. It's not so much about an eyewitness account like timeline as much it is about sometimes trying to convey a theological message. What the example I used before is something like Jonah, the 3 days and 3 nights. Like, well, it's not literal when Jesus was compared to Jonah with 3 days and 3 nights. It's more metaphorical to connect him to Jonah, and that's really what's going on. So, Than, you mentioned that there was another thing about like how to view like the narrative structure. How was that?
Yeah, so kind of just elaborating on your point here. When I'm talking about fact changing literary devices, one example of many could be something like achronological narration versus dyschronological narration. So here's just a modern example of this. Let's just say yesterday, the sequential timeline events that happened in my day yesterday was like I woke up, had breakfast, worked, went to the gym, hung out with my family, and went to bed. Okay, that's the timeline of events. Here's an example of a chronological narration of that day. Yesterday, I went to the gym. I had some breakfast. I also hung out with my family a little bit. Yeah, I just had a lot of work to do. You'll notice when I'm recalling the events of yesterday, there's no like temporal relationship that I'm in my language. Um, and temporal just meaning like time bound relationship between any of the events. It's just a conjunction of everything that happened in my day. I'm not telling you like the sequential location of any of those events. That's a chronological narration. I'm not changing any facts when I'm doing that. This chronological narration would be something like, yeah, yesterday I woke up, and then I went to the gym, and then I hung out with my family, and then I finally got to work. I decided to do all that stuff first because I really wanted to focus on being a better husband and father, um, rather than just being the typical workaholic that I am. Notice what happened there is I took everything that really happened that day, but I changed the temporal sequence of events that happened. And I even told you the motivation there, which was I did all those things first and then I did this. And the reason why is because I want to be a good father. Now, analogously, this is the difference between the literary device theorist and people like me and you, where maybe you, well, I don't know exactly where you land the plan on everything, Will, but at least for me, um, here's an example. A lot of skeptical scholars and critical scholars will point to the synoptics and John when it comes to the date of the crucifixion of Jesus. The synoptics, so the skeptic will say, have Jesus being crucified on Friday, and John moves the date of the crucifixion to Thursday because they want Jesus die. John wants Jesus dying on Friday because he is the Passover feast. He is the Paschal lamb. And that's why John moves the crucifixion to Thursday, so Jesus dies on Friday.
To more emphasize that theological point.
Correct. Now, here's the problem. That's a really forced contradiction, because if you just read the Greek of John, you'll actually see that John actually does not move the date of the crucifixion. He agrees with the synoptics. He literally uses the Greek word paraskevi, which is Friday, even in today's parlance in Greek. So that's just one example of many. Alex likes to point to other examples too, which we can kind of get into if you want to, with like the flight to Egypt and all this other stuff. But that's like the basic tension between the two camps.
Right.
And I take the model that I do, one, because I think the evidence supports it, but also if you allow for fact-changing literary devices, which I want to clear something up here, I think. When I say I'm not allowing for those, right? What I'm not saying is that no way, Jose did do this. I refuse to believe that. That's not what's going on. There's two hypotheses on the table, right? The historical reportage model, right, predicts that they would not use these things, and therefore the prior probability of any fact changing is going to be really low if that model's true. Likewise, the literary device model that Alex would probably even endorse, right, is going to be the complete different one, where the harmonizations, the prior probability is going to be low, and the prior probability of any contradiction being true is going to be high, and fact changing is going to be high. And so this debate does boil down to, well, which model has better evidence for it? And one of the biggest problems in modern scholarship, man, I'm yapping right now, but I'm passionate about this. I'm sorry.
I love it. Keep going.
One of my problems with the modern scholarship of this topic is that this literary device model is almost taken as axiomatic. Like, it's just assumed that this is what authors did and would do and always did. And there's so much more to say here. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no worries. And so, well, and then for those who don't know, that's where like the literary devices, that's all it is. It's a literary device that might change the sequence of events in order to convey a moral of the story. I always like to point to Revelation when people are having a hard time figuring it out, because everyone knows that Revelation has a lot of pictures that convey a meaning, right?
Yes.
And so it's kind of helpful when people are like, oh, I see. Like, so yeah, when he's talking about like the dead who come out of the grave, and we'll talk about that here soon, Dan. It's more to make a theological point than a literal eyewitness point by point takedown.
Yeah, and something really important I think people really miss when it comes to Revelation. Again, this is me being super dorky. I don't expect people to get into the Greek all the time. But the author of Revelation literally starts his work by saying, I'm going to communicate to you in semeons, which is signs. He is literally telling you, hey, none of this is really going to be literal. This is all going to be like typological, pictorial, like telegraphing that I'm going to be giving you. That's a completely different opening than, say, for instance, how Luke opens his gospel, when he grounds his work in eyewitness testimony, in investigation, and all this other stuff. So
Right. And then and then for the audience who's not into this really big nerd stuff, and by the way, it's okay to be nerdy. People are pretty used to it on this channel.
Okay.
So if you go to the other side, the maximal data approach is going to be the names that are most often attached to it in the apologetics world is going to be Dr. Tim and Lydia McGrew and
Yes.
Dr. Jonathan McClatchy. That's who are kind of known to really be promulgating this. They're not the originators of it, as they are very. I mean, there's William Paley and there's a lot of others who have like brought things up in the past. And one of the things that they'll point to, which we will discuss going forward here soon, is things like the undesigned coincidences. In other words, if you have this, if you have these gospels, and these gospels were actually written by eyewitnesses, the maximal data people will say that this is an eyewitness testimony that these people are accounting for. And if an event took place and you had everyone write a report of what took place, you're going to notice that there's weird ways that the reports connect to each other so long as everyone's being honest. And one of the ways that we see this in the gospel accounts is at the feeding of the 5,000. One gospel is like, hey, by the way, this was during the time of the Passover, which is springtime. And then the other gospel just says, and the people sat down on the patches of green grass. But if you've ever been to the ancient world, or even the Near East at all, or in the Middle East, you'll notice there's not a lot of grass unless there's springtime, which means that there's this weird connection that doesn't just happen magically when people are just copying people's work. And there's a lot of those sorts of things that are kind of dripped throughout the gospel accounts. I personally, in my position on this, is I think there's actually a lot of epistemological reasons to go with a lot of the arguments for the maximal data, but I also think there's probably some literary devices that are used just because I think there's idioms that were used back in the ancient day, but I think that those are pretty clear when they take place, and most people can usually pick up on them as well. But I don't get into like I'm not like hostile in this area, but I know it can get pretty dicey between the
I'm not
two
either.
worlds.
I'm not hostile to this at all. I will say this. I'm also open to literary devices. Even I think, and even Tim and Lydia McGrew are open to them. The only difference is the fact changing ones. It's specifically the ones that change facts or make up history. That those are the ones that are not compatible with the historical reportage model that we kind of put up. So like if there's a literary device like telescoping, well, that's fine. That doesn't tell me that, because I think Luke does telescoping a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't tell me that Luke is making up history, right? That just tells me that Luke is condensing a narrative for a specific purpose. But
which we all do. We all do that very naturally. So just so everyone knows that there is a tension between these two camps, and that's mainly because they're both adamantly trying to defend the Gospels. I don't try to throw ill will on people with it. I think they're all adamantly trying to defend the Gospels with what they actually truly think is true. And sometimes people don't hear the other side out very well. And I just want to be the guy who's like, hey, I have friends I literally have good friends of mine on both sides of this. And I think the world of many people. So with that, I think it'd be good for us to jump in now, because Alex O'Connor, his claims that you interacted with him, we've already talked about the problem of evil that you didn't get much of a chance to discuss with him.
I wish I could have gone up for that.
Yeah, definitely. And then he also actually mentioned the Canaanite slaughter. And maybe we real quick, actually, what kind of argument would you have made when he said that God commanded the genocide of the Canaanites? Would you take like a Paul Copan approach? Do you think?
No, So I'll say this.
Hyperbole.
I'll say this from the outset. I don't know in hindsight what the right way to approach this rhetorically would have been, given what I know about, given my experience in like the aftermath of everything. I'm going to lay that out on the table. Putting that aside, I have a really unique view, actually, that we'd be here for like 3-4 hours to talk about. So here's the condensed version. Okay. How about that? Because there's so many puzzle pieces to this. Like, let's even take a step way back further and ask like a philosophical question about like ethics and like value and stuff like that. I'm what you would call like a ethical contextualist, right? And so whether or not an act is justified is going to be based upon that, what like narrative that act is embedded in, right? But you have to get the whole narrative to really assess the ethics of what happens in that time and place in that narrative. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. So that's like the value backdrop to everything else I'll say. From there, you have like a bunch of puzzle pieces you have to ask yourself. Like, for instance, I take an emergent approach to Yahweh worship. And so what I think happened is um, I take a late dating Exodus, kind of like what Mike from Inspiring Philosophy takes. And I think what you see is in the land of Canaan, you see a mixed multitude of people emerging out of Egypt. And that's where like we start seeing Yahweh worship happening. But notice this is a mixed multitude of people in the land of Canaan. So kind of like how you hear things like, I think it's every rectangle, not every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square. Is that the right line? Right.
Yeah.
In the same way, all Israelites are Canaanites, but not all Canaanites are Israelites. Which
I like it.
which gets you to a weird puzzle now that you have to solve, which is what does the word Canaanite mean? Because if you look at the Hebrew, you also see some other motifs. Like for instance, Adam and Eve, I think, are typologically shown as the first literary Canaanites. So you have like literary Canaanites, geographical Canaanites, ethnic Canaanites, theological Canaanites, all these things happening. And I want to point that to this, put that aside. It's just right now I'm doing is throwing puzzle pieces. We could have a whole stream on this. Okay, from there, long story short, I think the harem passages are rhetorical shock devices in the same way that Jesus says, for instance, pluck out your eye if it causes you to sin, right? It's a command meant to shock you for the purpose of getting some like a point across for another command, right? For Jesus, it's like, yeah, don't sin. It's that serious. With the harem passages, you actually first see them in the context of idols, right? And then it's not until later you see them applied to people. But the whole point of applying them to people is for the rhetorical shock value of Yahweh only worship. That's the whole entire point here. From there, another puzzle piece I would point to is the subversive nature of these war texts. So, for instance, like the very first mention of weaponry is prior to the invasion in Joshua, I think it is. And do you know what happens with the very first mention of weapons before they invade?
No.
They circumcise themselves.
Oh, yikes.
With flint swords.
Oh.
Does that sound like a good military strategy?
No.
Right. And so, like, and then after that, you have an angel appearing with a sword, talking about various things that are subversive again to warfare. Moving on from there, and again, if I'm yapping a lot, sorry. Moving on from there, then you can kind of then I'm going to point to other aspects where I think you have tons of evidence for the idea that the targets of the warfare were actually symbols of power and symbols of pagan worship. So, like idols, gold and silver, weaponry, like Yahweh actually forbids them from using war horses, forbids them from using other types of weapons that he deemed too violent, right? Because he doesn't want his name attached to him, those things attached to him. And then kings. In ancient Near East, kings were symbols and extensions. They were the image of the gods that these pagan nations were worshiping, right? And so those were the targets. And then, like you started up, I do think there's hyperbole happening here because there's all those do not intermarry with them passages, all that other stuff.
Yeah, I know. Also, some of the fun parts is like, and we went to the Amalekites and we killed them all. And then it's like 2 chapters later, the Amalekites showed up again. And you're like, I thought you said you killed them all.
It's not just that. It's not just that, right? There's also the fact that you see Canaanite inclusion into the covenant of God.
Yes.
And God accepts them joyfully.
Yeah.
You also have the fact that Israelites are treated more harshly when they fall into pagan worship than non-Israelites. And there's tons of other puzzle pieces I can kind of point to. I could also point to the subversive nature in text where God is like anti-war, all this other stuff. Like he rejects David, a temple post-war, right? In the Joshua narrative, Israel wants a king. Samuel calls God. God's like, no, you don't want a king. If you want a king, these are the things that's going to happen. More war. My name will be attached to violence. People will get taxed. People will be soldiers. Blah, 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 blah. I don't want those things. God eventually gives them a king and tells them this is what's going to happen. And that's the whole entire point of the Joshua narrative, right?
Right.
And
It
no,
happened.
right, it happens, and it's meant to portray. Oh no, what's his name? The king. Why am I brain farting so bad?
Samuel?
Yes, it's meant. It's meant. No, it's not Samuel. Samuel's not the king.
Solomon?
Solomon. Who? Oh my gosh!
Which king? There's a lot of kings.
I know the king who left the king who left the king alive. That kept the best of the livestock alive. Why am I brain farting so bad right now? Here, hold on. I can find it.
Yeah. Isn't it? I thought it was. Isn't it Samuel?
Saul.
Oh, duh. Yeah, David and Saul.
In First Samuel.
No, trust us, guys. We know our Bibles.
Dude, in my defense, I don't have a defense. I just brain farted really badly there.
No, I mean, I have a defense. I was up to like 1 a.m. taking teenagers to Winter Jam. Your boy's cooked.
Fair enough. But like, the whole entire point of that narrative is to cast Saul in a bad light because he's going against the commands of God. Like, and people like Alex will bring this up, by the way, as an objection, actually. But I just think they misread the text because of the narrative context. Saul leaves the king and the best of the livestock alive, and then typically the skeptic will be like, "Well, okay," and God's mad at them for and actually, like Alex will say stuff like that. He'll be like, "For this one small act of mercy, God is mad at Saul." But that's not what's going on here, because one, we actually have other people alive after this, but also the reason why God is mad at Saul is because in the ancient Near East, if you leave a king alive, you can use him as a prop to elevate yourself in the ancient Near East as like a really powerful king.
Right, because he's under your foot.
Exactly. And then from there, he leaves the best of the livestock alive, not because he's a nice guy, right? In the ancient Near East, you keep the livestock and you use this to bribe the community. And again, to show that you're a really good king. And he plays this double sword thing. He plays this double play, right? Because then he also tries to play the pious person, sacrificing the best of the animals. But he's doing it. He's doing everything just to prop himself up rather than to be faithful to the covenant code of God. Right. And that's like the narrative context here. Well, again, I could talk about this for a really long time. I've done so much work on this, but that's I
love it. No, because I'll summarize this when I talk to students. Because sometimes they get the shock value. I'm like, well, and I'll get nerdy with some of the ones who I clearly need to be nerdy with. But one of the things I also like to just point out, I'm like, whenever we're reading like ancient warfare passages, we have to remember we are dealing with the ancient Near East. It was not the same culture, and also it was far more, for lack of a better term, barbaric. Yes. And some people are like, well, should a God be better than that? Like, could God's people like not be participate in that? If they didn't commit like intense warfare, they would all have been wiped out. That was part of it. That's why I think the cultural ethical lens is actually really important, because we live in a post-Geneva Convention world, post-Enlightenment period. We have all of these different nation states that are all united together. We are the United Nations and stuff. They didn't have that. They were one kingdom amidst a lot of kingdoms, and a lot of those kingdoms wanted to rape, murder, and pillage. So you have to put yourself in that situation of like, okay, you have that enemy and he's right over that hill. What do you do about it? And some friends of mine who are really big into this pointed out there's even record of like children who would kill, like if you go into just Japan in the 1940s with China and the rape of Nanking and all those. Like they raised those kids since they were kids. Look at the Chinese as dogs and inhuman and deserving of death. So we need to understand that sometimes as well, to pull yourself out of your little sanitary 21st century world and insert yourself back then, going, okay, maybe it's not as clean cut as I thought, and God wants to show mercy, but also there is this war that takes place, and that war oftentimes encroaches upon Israel's own door.
Yeah, and just to clarify there, because I agree with you, I take this incremental movement ethic hermeneutic to this as well. To clarify though, and I would assume you agree here, this isn't like moral subjectivism, like it was okay back then, because of the time and place. This is God interacting and meeting humanity where they're at, and moving the ethical line of scrimmage slowly but surely. Which is why I bring up this ethical contextualist point in the very beginning of everything, because you also have to take into account that these one, I think all but one of these battles was defensive in nature.
Hmm.
Two, all of these nations are not atheists that are just like, oh yeah, I guess they just like worship some god. No, they're actively antagonistic against Yahweh worship.
Yeah.
Like they want to eradicate Yahweh worship. That's
Yep.
what's going on here. And a third point to consider is that the whole meta narrative of the Bible starts with a promise to a family, which eventually becomes a nation, and God has to hold to that promise to keep these people going, right? So there's actually like obligations on God's ends here that people don't really think about. Um, One thing I do want to bring up that people tend to miss here is, and you can cut this out if you want to, if it gets too graphic, right? Because like in the ancient Near East, war rape was a
Oh
huge
yeah.
thing, right? And I can get into all the nuance here. And this is one example of many of the ethical movement of the Israelites apart from the ancient Near East. Because, and by the way, we have independent evidence of this too, because you actually have um, external evidence to the biblical story of nations talking about the mercy of the Israelite war machine, right?
Hmm.
Um, but one example is like one on war rape. In the ancient Near East, you have all these depictions of war rape being glorified. In the biblical story, in Israelite with the Israelites, it's forbidden.
Yep.
It is forbidden. And some people might be like, well, there's no explicit verses about this, but it's like you don't have to have that because you have all these other layers of law that would forbid this in the first place. If the Ark of the Covenant is present, sexual purity is demanded. Guess what? Guess where the Ark of Covenant is during wartime? With
With
the
them.
soldiers.
Yeah.
This is part of the reason, by the way, why David is cast in such a bad light when he has his affair with Bathsheba.
Hmm.
Because David, first of all, the king should be with his military during the war, but he's not. But also during wartime, when sexual acts are specifically forbidden, he
He's
not,
committing
not
them.
only just has an affair, but he's breaking covenant code by engaging in sexual impurity and sexual acts during wartime, which was
Yep.
strictly forbidden. So like there's so many layers to this that people just don't see right away.
Correct. Yeah. And well, and the other thing with that is, if you were in war and you saw a woman that you even wanted to, like in Israel, you were expected to marry them.
Yes.
Like, and you had to give her a mourning period, then you had to marry her. And then if you wanted to divorce her, it was like a shame unto you.
Yes.
Like it was there,
Which,
and
this still sounds horrible in our modern
yeah,
lights, but and it is, right? It is. It's still horrible. And I don't think God would sit here and endorse that as the ethical Edenic
yeah,
ideal,
it's the is ought fallacy, right?
right?
Just
The point is, this is God moving humanity forward.
right.
That's what's happening here. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And also, I don't think people realize as well that how that was very normal. Like even women expect that, and for women just to be like, "Wait, I like they
Oh,
don't."
I'm your wife now.
Yeah, I'm your wife. You're not assaulting me. Oh, I get to live in your house, and I'm treated with dignity. And because they actually had strict laws on how men could treat their wives, even so, they don't realize like actually. There are records of like people who actually wanted to become Israelites because of the ethical way that they behaved compared to the
Yeah.
Canaanites. So anyway, we don't need to get too much into that, but that is actually really like it's a really fast. I love that study because it's just so interesting.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you had a response there. But yeah, I don't think because there are some, and that's the thing. It's like the Canaanite warfare. Whenever I'm talking to atheists, even and Alex O'Connor, as much as I think he's a really nice guy. He seems like he's articulate. He, like many atheists, he's kind of falls into the trap of I'm not sure if you've actually studied the context of the things you're complaining about enough.
Yeah.
And because of that, it makes it really difficult to even have conversations with people with that, because it means that you have to set so much groundwork to even get them caught up with you. But as soon as they hear something they don't like, that usually they cut you off and you're like, hear me out.
Yeah.
So anyway, which is ironic because a lot of the people I've interacted with say we need to respect every culture equally, but then as soon as the biblical culture of the ancient Near East comes up, they don't like it.
I know.
This is my complaints, okay, not Than's. So anyway, I would love for us to actually start responding here to Alex and because you were trying to do a lot.
Yeah.
And I think because it is an interdisciplinary thing to defend the resurrection, and also same with other parts of this. I don't think a lot of people realize these defenses are multidisciplinary. There are there's a lot
the
of
objections are too.
Yes.
A rhetorical thing to clear up, by the way, just really quick. It's how do I word this? Okay, I'll just try my best, and then if it doesn't make sense, you can call me stupid. It's just because there are less words in the objection or the argument against the resurrection does not mean that it is less complex of a statement than somebody like me who might actually take the responsibility of breaking everything down and separating and then reintegrating those disciplines. In other words, it's really easy to just say, well, it didn't happen because dead people stay dead, and the gospels aren't reliable because there's contradictions and all this other stuff, right? Just because I said it that fast in that short of words doesn't mean that it's that simple. Because I could easily just flip the script and go, oh, yeah, well, Jesus rose from the dead because he is God incarnate, and God incarnate probably would come back to life after he dies. And the Gospels are definitely written by eyewitness testimony people and grounded in historical facts. So just, I feel like people really miss things because things happen really fast and they don't see the undergirding layers of everything that's going on when a statement's made.
And also, it's really easy just to kind of make the specific claim, like the specific points. Like this is one of the things I've mentioned. I had some angry atheists in the comments of my last video, which happens. Okay, you get the Reddit atheists that come along and start spewing stuff.
I'm used to them.
Yeah. So the thing is because what I oftentimes hear is like, well, it's on you to prove that Jesus rose from the dead. And yes, sure. Okay. Proving Jesus rose from the dead, bringing forth evidence. Great. I'm with you on that. I'm an evidentialist. But it's also incumbent upon those who hear the evidence to actually come up with another inference to the best explanation.
Yeah.
And when you connect all the different interdisciplinary threads, it becomes increasingly more difficult. And I actually don't see a lot of atheists legitimately interact with the things that are presented, but oftentimes dismiss out of hand as, but that doesn't say X, Y, and Z. I think I saw that the most when you interacted actually with Alex on Jesus never claiming to be God, where I'm like, okay, but when you get all the crossing threads here,
yeah,
what else does that mean?
Yeah.
And so whenever we run into that, it's not just atheists that do this. I mean, I had Unitarians. Yeah, Christians do it. I had Unitarians and Jehovah's Witnesses in my video complaining about it. Like, nope, that's not it. I'm like, you still got to work with this. Anyhow.
Yeah.
So with that, I'm going to go ahead and play. We have both conversations with Alex here. I'm going to go ahead and play them. And Than, go ahead and tell me to pause whenever you want to tell me to pause and when you want to respond, okay? And I might interject here and there and say what you thought about it or whatever. So let's go. You ready?
It's your show, man. Whatever you want to do.
All right, let's go.
Sorry,
No, sorry.
Thank you.
My next claim is that there is insufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection. Okay.
I just wanted to comment real fast. I loved how when you talk about the evidence of the resurrection, there's literally only two of you went forward, which was both funny and depressing.
I wish I would have had more time on this. At the end of the day, I wish I had more time.
I agree. I was like, oh, he's gonna do the thing, and then he wasn't able to do the thing. But all right, we'll keep trucking.
Nice to meet you. How's it going?
This is a really interdisciplinary question for the resurrection of Jesus. And in my experience, it kind of boils down into two categories. The prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus and the data itself.
So what I'm really interested in is the historical case of the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay, I want to ask a clarifying question because I would love to talk about the data. But if I were to give you a model of the Gospels that I would call like the historical reportage model, which would say something along the lines of the authors of the Gospels were close to the times and places of the historical Jesus. They rooted their historical work in eyewitness testimony and did not feel the freedom to make up historical facts. Because of that, we can extract all the testimonies from these Gospels, and we have access to what the original eyewitnesses actually said and did.
Okay, so who do you think are the eyewitnesses that the testimony is being based on?
So this is where I'm not a walking encyclopedia, but I would say if you looked at all the testimonies, we have 21 unique testimonies that are going to be polymodal in nature. They're going to have semblances of independence and interdependence and some dependence because of the synoptic problem, all that stuff. If we were to get there, would that be enough for you to say,
the probability that the resurrection happened relative to any other countering theory is higher.
No, I don't think so.
So that tells me then that, one, it could be the prior probability still. That's an issue. Because if that's not enough evidence.
It's not that. I think that the authors of the Gospels, specifically on the resurrection, can't be trusted to be giving an accurate account of what happened.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking if we had this.
Pause there really quick.
Yeah.
Did you catch what happened?
Which part? The fact that he just says he doesn't think that they can be trusted?
Yeah. So dialectically, do you see what happened there?
No.
Okay. So I started out my question by separating the evidence and the prior probability, right?
Right. Prior probability is dead people don't come back.
Well, yeah. So like slightly more dorky would be something like the prior probability of any event or hypothesis being true is just the probability of that thing being true before you look at any evidence, given your background knowledge. Right. So like background knowledge is dead people stay dead, but there's other things in our background knowledge too. Like somebody might say God exists. Right.
Right.
So that's going to be the prior probability discussion. And that's really important because of like Humean type arguments where somebody might say like no testimony will ever be enough to overcome the low prior probability of a miracle. Right. And that's why I'm asking that question the way I am, because there's a conditional in my question as well, which is if we had this historical reportage model, and if we had all those testimonies in this kind of capacity, would that be enough to tell you that? Would that be enough to tell you that the probability that Jesus rose from the dead is higher than the competing theories? He said no, and then he cuts me. And then when I try to explain what I think is going on, he cuts me off and says, "Well, no, it's a no because I think the historical reportage model is true." But if you notice, he said no originally to the conditional question that I had. Right, which was if the historical reportage model is true. And then notice that I wanted to try to talk about the prior probability to uncover some stuff there. But then he reassesses and re-answers the question by denying the conditional that I had up in the first place to try to segue into gospel reliability, which I was more than happy to talk about. But it's a really subtle shift that I think a lot of people missed.
Yeah, I was gonna say I didn't even catch that.
Yeah.
So interesting. Do you think he just did that rhetorically, or do you think
I don't have access to his mind, right? Like it could be the fact that he was not. It could be the fact that I was being a poor communicator and he misunderstood me. It could be the fact that it was just a sly rhetorical shift and reframe. I don't have access to his mental state though, so
fair enough. Don't psycho analyze it.
Yeah, I don't like when people do it to me, and I don't want to do it to other people.
I like psychoanalyzing you, Than.
You can psychoanalyze me all you want.
You're a terrible person. I'm just kidding.
I am.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and play.
Historical reportage model, and that was true.
Sure, well, if it were true that they were reporting historical events, then it would be a historical event, yeah.
So let me clarify.
I don't think that they are.
Yeah, I got where you're coming. Let me clarify one thing here. The historical reportage model does not entail what the reporting actually happened. All I'm saying is that we can extract from there is that these were the actual eyewitness testimonies to the risen Jesus.
Okay, so I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that Jesus is the only person, outside of the people that Jesus and the apostles rose from the dead, do you think that he's the only person in human history that's risen from the dead?
Yes.
Okay, so Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 27, says that at the time of the death of Jesus,
Also
the graves of Jerusalem...
I'll say this really quick. People really misinterpreted that pause. That pause was me going, okay, I can say no and then try to get out the distinction between resurrection and resuscitation, and all this other stuff. That pause was me going, what's my best move here to try to keep this topic to a minimum so we can get back on track. That was the pause there. That was not me going, oh man, I don't know the answer to that question.
So you mean you're taking a moment to think, which is a good thing to do, to think before you speak. And now some people might have an issue. And now, well, actually, you know what? Let's talk about. We're gonna let him finish his thought here. We'll talk about resuscitations here in a minute, because I think some Christians might have an issue with you saying that no one else resurrected from the dead, or agreeing with that. Yeah. Because of some of the prior.
There have been a lot. So yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that here in a minute.
Opened, and the holy ones got out of their graves, and then interestingly says then after the resurrection appeared to many. Many of them walked around appearing to many. Do you think that happened?
So I would just say that if the historical reportage model is true, then yes.
So you think?
But hold on. The problem there is those are also talking about resuscitations most likely, not resurrections.
Yeah, but what we're talking about here is the graves of Jerusalem opening and many people getting out of their graves, walking around Jerusalem
Sure.
and appearing to
If
many
I
people.
say yes, what's at stake
If
there?
this happened, this would be the most extraordinary event that's ever happened in human history. And yet,
And then you're going to make an
it is
argument
not
from silence
reported-
from there.
Some arguments from silence do work. It is
I
not
understand
reported,
that, but then
hold on,
that's
hold on.
only one
It's-
piece of
it's not
evidence that you're
reported
gonna use.
anywhere else. It's not reported in any of the other Gospels.
I
It's not in
understand.
Josephus. It's not
So
in Acts.
that's one
It's
data
not
point.
anywhere.
Let's just- well,
so,
for-
so, but hold on, let me finish this thought because this is important. A lot, most Christian scholars, I think, so people like Dale Allison, for example,
Yeah.
believe
You want
that
to
this
pause
didn't
after
actually
that,
happen.
or
Yeah.
yeah, because you said you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, so okay, I wasn't sure how much further we were going to let them go in there. So, but
Yeah.
like, so he talks about the graves that break out. It's only in one gospel. It's not repeated in the others. Josephus doesn't even mention it. All those things, and so therefore, this most extraordinary event that ever happened in history. Well, I would actually just go, yeah, the resurrection did a lot of crazy stuff. So it is. But what people might have an issue with is that some people take that very literally, that these people did come out, just like Alex is here, that they were resurrected and now walking around like a bunch of zombies, that as atheists would like to mockingly say.
Yeah.
Now, then you mentioned that there's a difference between resurrections and resuscitations. And now there are things like in even the Old Testament prophets, like Elijah and them, who have brought somebody back, or Jesus and Lazarus. So what is this distinction you're making here? And can you explain what your view of that Matthew passage was?
Yeah, so the distinction between a resurrection and resuscitation, all I mean when I say that is a resurrection is something like what happened to Jesus, in which it's permanent and extends into the eschaton. A resuscitation is something where they come back to life, but they're still in their protological, meaning like this side of life body, and they eventually will die again, waiting for resurrection. That's the distinction. My view of the Matthew passage is that it's literal. It actually happened. And I think people do some really weird stuff here, because here's one consideration. Skeptics especially like to argue that Jesus probably wasn't buried in a tomb because people, one, would be left on the cross to die in dirts and blah, 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 blah. Also, people were rarely buried in tombs because not many people had access to tombs and blah, 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 blah. People would typically just be buried in the ground. You get the point.
Mm-hmm.
But why are we shifting and all of a sudden and going, this would have been a huge event. All these people coming out of tombs and walking around. What? So which is it? Right?
Good point.
I think what's going on here is probably a small amount of people came out of their tombs and talked with other people, and they were resuscitated. This isn't like within the context of the times and place that Matthew's writing about. People wouldn't have seen this as like a astounding event and all this other stuff. Like, so that's one consideration. So I think it's literal. I have no reason to think Matthew would make this up, given what I think about the rest of the Gospels and the evidence for the historical reportage model. And then Alex will point out that nobody else writes about this. We do have other extant writings about this through Quadratus. Now, given the fact that he's not an eyewitness to this or anything like that, but we do have him writing about it. So it's not true that nobody else mentions this event. But from there, then, without getting too dorky, I think arguments from silence in general are very weak and don't work. At best, an argument from silence will present you with a very, very, very weak probabilistic hit against the authenticity of the event that Alex wants to point to. A really good paper on this, if you want to see the dorky side of stuff and the math there, is literally titled "The Argument from Silence." Dr. Timothy McGrew wrote it.
Okay. And yeah, Dr. Tim McGrew is a beast, as we all know. So, and he's also like one of the funniest and nicest people ever. Like,
Yeah, I love him.
It's great. I actually just referenced his work in a recent video about miracles at the Responding Cameron Bertuzzi. So it was just, with Marian apparitions and stuff. So, but now so that is actually, I think, beneficial for people to understand, because I think some Christians would be like, but other people were brought back. It's like, no, you're saying they were brought back, but we're calling resuscitations because they still like died.
Yeah.
They're not around today. So the resurrection that is promised to every believer is an eternal resurrection.
Correct.
So it does not end. So I think that might be one of those areas where it's one of those really good distinctions to be making. But I think some Christians may have just been like, wait, what?
Yeah. Well,
So-
and to be fair, Alex, I made that distinction in that conversation, and Alex just glazed over it.
which is kind of wild to me, actually, because I was expecting, because even when you said that, I was like, huh, I wonder how Than would define that. And he, like, it just stuck out to me, and then it got glossed over, and I was like,
Yeah.
okay. So, all right, well, let's keep trucking and see what else is said here.
Well, I'm not interested in what Allison's going to say.
The door that this opens.
What I'm interested in is what the data says.
The door-
So
but
if
the-
we have the historical reportage model, right?
But you keep saying we have this model.
That's fine. Let me give you some evidence for the historical reportage model.
Sure.
If this model is true, one of the things I would expect to see would be things like undesigned coincidences within the Gospels.
Yep.
Tiny little interlocking
Okay, for the sake of time, I understand what you're saying. So I think that a lot in the Gospels is historically reliable and a lot is not. Things like undesigned coincidences
So
are
you're
really
taking a
interesting.
pericope by pericope approach to this, or how is, like, what methodology?
I'm taking
are
it
you
story by story. I don't think that the
I
graves.
think I don't think that's a good
I
methodology.
don't think that the graves at Jerusalem were opened. I don't
So
think that there were people
that's
walking
fine. I
around.
understand where you're coming
But if
from.
that's the case, then that means that at least the author of Matthew is willing to invent
I don't
stories
think that's the
of
case.
resurrection
Well,
in order
hold
to make
on,
a
you're making
theological
big
point.
inference there, right?
Well, hold
What
on.
do you? Okay,
Okay,
we can pause there really
Yeah,
quick. 'Cause
yep.
a lot of things happened there very quickly. What was your read there? I'm just
The
curious.
read there was it did move fast. You brought up the undesigned coincidences, and then he was and he just basically goes, hey, for the sake of time, fast forward. I'm familiar with this argument, which is fine. But then when you were like, all right, so then what's your methodology? Is it a pericope by pericope approach? He then just goes, it's a story by story. You point out that it's not a good methodology, you don't think, but then it kind of starts moving even faster from there. And I think what the issue is that you were about ready to go into the epistemological reasons, because like you can't just take it story by story because it's within a gospel account of someone who's claiming to be an eyewitness of something. So if you go story by story, you're kind of missing the forest for the trees on what the writer's intent even is to convey here. So you can't just say it's story by story just because you're like, well, I like this and I don't like this. This seems legitimate because it mentions a ruler that I'm familiar with in land, but because it mentions a miracle, no. Why? Because, well, miracles don't happen. It's almost like in a weird way, it's almost like a presuppositional worldview in a sense of like, well, I can't accept these because they actually go against my current worldview.
Yeah.
But I can only accept the ones that seem to line up with it.
Yeah, I want to add into this. I actually just think it's a mathematically flawed approach to do the story by story approach, because, and when I say math, sorry if that sounds really dorky, but what I mean when I say
People who watch this channel, they're dorks. So keep going.
Okay,
Sorry, audience,
okay.
but you know what you are.
I've been like trained to like not be nerdy. That's all at this point. But okay, so what I'm trying to get at here though is if you're taking a pericope by pericope approach, what ends up happening more often than not is that people will treat every pericope is probabilistically independent from other pericopes within the same gospels. That is done on the assumption, by the way, on the fact-changing literary device hypothesis. But the other issue is that if you're taking a pericope by pericope approach and treating them as probabilistically independent, what you're doing is some mathematical malpractice, because the prior probability of any particular pericope being true, right? That whatever the prior probability is going to be probabilistically tied to the track record that any particular gospel author has of giving you actual events that are not made up and are actually grounded in history. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And for those, by the way, who might be a little lost or confused, I'm just going to quickly summarize. Pericope is basically summarized as a set of a passage or a set of verses.
Yeah.
That forms one coherent thought or unit. So that's why it's useful to go that's why he was like, oh, so are you taking this approach? Because are you going just by section, kind of going doing that? And he just says story by story. So it's not really a standard pericope by pericope, but anyway. This is now what do you think is? I feel like there's a fatal flaw here, though. In not only did you mention the mathematic thing, but I still think it still doesn't deal with things like the minimal facts, the interconnections, help me out, my brain
Undesigned
is toast.
coincidences?
Yeah, thank you. Undesigned coincidences. Wow, we've both brain farted now in this
Yeah,
interview. That's good.
So
It's great.
What he's saying. Yeah. So this is my read on what Alex is doing, which is I think he's doing what he should be doing in this instance, if I'm him, right?
Yeah.
Which is, like there's reliable things in the Gospels. They do get things right. But I think that they're overall not reliable because the authors are making things up.
Well, what's interesting why I still don't think that works, and just I'm gonna get my little hobby horse for a minute. It is just because if there are these undesigned coincidences in them, it's really odd then that these guys who are claimed to be eyewitnesses have these interlocking details and are claiming the same quote unquote made up stories while also connecting so many seemingly unconnected events together by accident. So there is, because such a casualness, like, okay, just feeding the 5,000, that's a miracle, right? Why is it then that multiple eyewitnesses would have such tiny little details that actually connect to it and then actually tell the same narrative? It seems very odd. It just seems like exactly what I would expect from an eyewitness testimony and not something from people who made it up, especially because we know that the gospel accounts, especially the synoptics, were written at different periods of time and across different geographical locations. So I know there's the Q problem and all that, but
to be fair to Alex here, what he's trying to do is cast doubt, because like you can grant all that stuff, but then you can just give particular instances that you might think Matthew's making stuff up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to cast doubt on whether or not the particular eyewitness testimony that you see in regards to the resurrection accounts are authentic or not. So I think the move that he's making here is, again, like the one you should be doing, which is fine. Grant
his
the
position,
stuff.
he absolutely should be doing that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think it was nasty. I like, this is the part of the thing where I was like, okay, I don't really feel like he dealt with what you were doing, because I didn't think he allowed you to really lay it out and then actually like dealt with the evidence. But I did feel like he was doing what he should be doing.
Yeah. No, I didn't think this was nasty. I was getting frustrated at this point because this is where I started feeling like I'm getting filibustered. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of why I when I was watching this, I was like, oh, it's my boy, when you went and sat down. And then when this happened, I was like, come on, Alex, like let him do this. And this is where actually, like I pointed out, like Alex really just kind of keeps stopping the argument from progressing, which was frustrating to watch, because I think it would have been really, it would have been better if that didn't happen. But I also understand just time restraints. There's a lot of pressure, and in his position, yeah, he's versing 21 people, and he's got to look like he can deal with all of them.
Yeah.
So there is a rhetorical strength there. Anyway, okay, we'll keep trucking.
I know you like to, for instance, you like to talk about the flight to Egypt, and you like to say that Matthew invented the flight to Egypt.
Luke.
No, Luke's the one that doesn't mention it. Matthew's the one that mentions it.
Sorry, Matthew.
It's okay,
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, Matthew, and then typically the way you run this argument is Matthew invented the flight to Egypt. Luke doesn't mention it. The reason why Luke doesn't mention it is because it didn't happen. Matthew mentions it, and he tells us why, to put Jesus into prophecy. Here's a counter hypothesis.
Sure.
What if it's just the case that Matthew is not making up historical facts and he's doing some sort of midrash? And what I mean by this is that he's looking at this historical thing that happened, the flight to Egypt, and taking this Hosea passage, which, by the way, would be a kind of a clunky passage to use if you wanted to make up a historical fact for prophecy. Because that Hosea passage is not inherently...
I think we might be getting slightly off... I have to be allowed to speak here. I think we're getting slightly off topic. The problem with the birth narrative story is not just that the story is being
You can
invented
pause there
for
if you want
prophecy.
to. It looks like you had
Yeah.
something to say.
First off, the amount of flags that we're raising up at this point, this is where my cynicism just comes out, where I'm like, I feel like a lot of these Christians who are raising flags in that, like, don't know a good argument when they're seeing one. Anyway, but because the flight to Egypt situation, like, not only did you mention the Hosea passage, but you mentioned he's doing a kind of midrash. Now, some people don't know what a midrash is, especially if they're not familiar with like Judaism.
Well, even in my own maximalist camp, people got upset that I used that word. I think what specifically is happening here is called Peshem, which is a specific type of midrash. Sorry to cut you off. I keep going.
No, you're good. No. So, and the thing is with it, actually, it makes a lot of sense that he would do a midrash, because Matthew, anyone with just the most
Jewish
basic
training.
understanding, any sort of Jewish training knows that Matthew is heavily Jewish. And the rabbis back then were doing midrash. That was a thing. Now, can you do us a favor and explain what you mean by this, with what kind of midrash he was doing? What is a midrash for people who do not know? and we can move forward. I'm
Yeah.
trying to make sure we actually define the terms beforehand, not afterwards anymore. Trying to
Yeah,
remember that we're not getting too nerdy too quickly.
Okay, so I'll start with talking about this midrash thing, and then with the second thing I would want to bring up afterwards is actually another data point to support what I'm telling Alex at this point.
Yeah.
So starting with the midrash thing, midrash itself, in my opinion, doesn't really have a good enough definition to capture everything that happens within that category. So just think about it as a category of interpretation of Old Testament or Hebrew Bible passages in relation to your current time, right? That's the general category. Peshem specifically is like looking at a historical event that happens in front of you, and then looking back into the Old Testament typologically to find some sort of typological pattern to like relate and find meaning in whatever happened in your current time and place. One textbook example that you can find of this is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's called the Isaiah Peshem. You kind of look into that if you want to. And so that's all I'm meaning here. And so when I say Matthew's probably doing some sort of Peshem here, what I'm really saying is that Matthew's taking a historical event, which is the flight to Egypt, and he's doing Peshem here, finding some sort of typology in the Old Testament to find and connect that with Jesus. Further evidence of this being the case, by the way, is again what I said in that clip you just played, which I think Christians didn't like, which was if Matthew was wanting to make up a historical event to put Jesus into prophecy, I wouldn't expect him to find some clunky passage that is not explicitly messianic, right? Like,
Right.
I'm gonna expect him to go to Isaiah to do this. Instead, he goes to Amos, which is not messianic, and just finds a typological pattern, right? Now, the second point I wanted to make is that, and in hindsight, I should have known I wouldn't be able to get this out.
Hindsight's 2020, bro. You're good.
Yeah. And but the second point to support this hypothesis as well is the fact that we actually have an interlocking detail outside of the Gospels that supports the flight to Egypt. So in Matthew's Gospel, we read about Joseph coming back to Jerusalem with his family after the flight to Egypt, and he learns that Archelaus is reigning in Jerusalem. He's scared and diverts his family to Galilee. That is the only place we hear about. You've probably heard this before, Will, I'm assuming. So, sorry if I'm preaching to the choir. But we hear of Archelaus nowhere else in the Bible. Okay, so we're left with some questions. Well, why was Joseph scared? Why divert from Jerusalem to Galilee upon hearing about Archelaus? Well, we later find out in Josephus, what happens is after Herod dies, Archelaus takes over. He slaughters a bunch of Jews during Passover, cancels Passover, and you have this huge migration of Jews leaving. At the same time that Joseph is coming back home with his family, he most likely would have heard what happened and finds out where Archelaus is reigning, which is Jerusalem. So he diverts away from there into Galilee, where he knew it would be safer. So we have this like interlocking detail that is really expected if this was a historical event and not made up by Matthew.
100%.
So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Is anything else you want to say in this section?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Perfect.
We're told that that's why it's done. The problem is that it contradicts the other account.
Well, I'm totally fine with that. So if you look at the birth narratives altogether, I think there's room for one discrepancy, and that is that Luke doesn't mention it.
Luke says that they go to the temple.
What?
Luke says that they go to the temple.
Yeah,
so hold on.
I'm going to agree with you.
Let me finish it. Luke says that the family go to the temple and present Jesus in Jerusalem. Matthew says that they go to Egypt. They're very far away from each other. And we're told that they stay in Egypt until after the death of Herod. This is a contradiction.
So again, I actually agree.
Okay, pause. You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seats.
Did you want to hear where I was going to go with that?
Yes, I'd love to.
Okay. I don't know where I land the plane here. I'm still kind of just making up my mind on it in this aspect. That particular contradiction that Alex is bringing up, there's a harmonization that I'm not going to go into it for now. But also just like, I'm totally fine just kind of granting that maybe Luke just didn't know about the flight to Egypt, and that's why he doesn't include it in his narrative. Which, by the way, would support my historical reconstruction of the Gospels and the modeling of the Gospels.
Yeah, because he actually went and traveled after all the events to interview people anyway. So keep going.
Well, that's the whole entire point. Matthew had privileged access to the people involved in the infancy narratives. Luke maybe had access to them, but probably didn't. Right? He's interviewing people about all this stuff. So it could just be the fact that Luke is telescoping, or it could just be the fact that Luke doesn't mention it because he didn't know about it.
Right.
Big deal.
Right.
So
well, this goes to that whole weird thing that I've noticed that some people have when they're like criticizing the Gospels or something, where it's like they will pigeonhole a weird thing. Where like, well, why doesn't it say here? I'm like, I don't know. He doesn't need to. Like, it doesn't really get you here nor there. So yeah, it's funny. Here we go.
Good to see you again.
All right. Two things. Have you heard of the Cloud Rider motif?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Oh, the Cloud Rider motif.
Yeah. Okay. Then I'm assuming you've heard of like the two powers in heaven motif.
No.
Okay.
For those who don't know, the claim was Jesus never claimed to be God. That's where we're at in this. So that's why he's bringing up the Cloud Rider motif. If you watched my previous video, you already saw my thoughts on this directly, but let's go.
There's a Jewish historian named Alan Segal. He wrote a book called The Two Powers in Heaven. And what he talks about is there's this weird thing happening in the Hebrew Bible where there's almost like two Yahweh figures that they point to. So some verses, for instance, will say like Yahweh rained down fire from Yahweh. And so Philo of Alexandria in the Second Temple period talks about this two powers in heaven motif. And he says like there's two Yahwehs. There's the first power and the second power, but they're both Yahweh. It's almost like a sort of proto-Trinitarian view. That's one thing that I'll just kind of put there for now. Another puzzle piece here is you've heard about the Cloud Rider motif. So in the Ugaritic texts, in the Baal cycle, we see Baal referenced as the one who rides the clouds. And I think you can see that actually adopted by the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible as well. So Psalm 104 is like an exaltation psalm and actually talks about Yahweh being the one that rides the clouds in heaven. He is the king. I see that as kind of a polemic of calling Yahweh the king over Baal. Are we on the same page there?
Sure.
Okay. In Daniel 7, you'll see a messianic passage there about how God will come down, and you'll see the Son of Man come, riding in the clouds of heaven, and his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom.
Do you think Daniel thought that the Son of Man was going to be God, since he says that he's riding on a cloud?
This is a really interesting point.
I don't think that he did, because he was a Jewish writer.
I lean on saying yes, but I don't know if I can say that with
think-
like absolute certainty.
I interpreted that really like charitably as a question in that moment. Everybody I've talked to, everybody said was like, no, that was a derailing question. That was not curiosity on his end. This is why I'm not good at debate, by the way. It's like I just get excited to talk about this kind of stuff, and I just assume.
So this is probably where you and I are different. I'm always cynical, and I remain cynical, and I probably need to stop being always so cynical. And that's where I would instantly be like, oh, what are you doing? What are you like? Almost every question they ask, I'm like, why? What's your ulterior motive? And it's like, dude, some people are just asking you a question. I'm like, okay, good point. Yeah, that's right. I shouldn't always be hostile.
Yeah, maybe the people are wrong, and this was a genuine question. I just don't know what to think. I don't have access to a psyche, like I said, but
yeah,
everybody's telling me that was a derailing question, and I took the bait.
Well, I mean, at the same time, though, I actually think it allowed you to get into this difference here a little bit anyway. So I actually didn't really mind it because I think some people are actually really interested in this sort of conversation, enjoy some of the rabbit hole stuff, even though I still think you laid out a strong case within seconds on Jesus claiming to be God, and you use a different method than most people do. So, and we'll talk about that here in a minute because he brings up one of the ways that people do this.
Mm-hmm.
The prophet Daniel was expecting the Messiah to be God.
I think so.
Oh, sorry, the Son of Man to be God.
Who is that's a motif only applied to God. So you have this cloud rider motif.
So by the way, I do think that there are multiple things which people, even in Jesus' time, thought only God could do. Mm-hmm. Things like forgiving sins. And when Jesus does these things, he's not doing so in order to prove that he's God, but in order to prove that the Son of Man has the authority to do that.
I completely agree. This isn't that kind of an argument.
So this is the part where I wanted to mention so this is how a lot of people.
Sorry, keep going.
Oh yeah. So I we'll talk about that here. Not only do most people will argue when he says well, he might refer to himself as Lord. So people are like, it's Lord. See, that's him claiming God. But a lot of people don't realize Kyrios is not actually always a claim to godhood. It could just be a master or an authority or a king. It doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't necessarily equal God. So whenever someone pulls out a verse right here, this is claiming godhood, and it's Kyrios or Lord, it's not a very strong case. It can be added into the case of the rest, but if it was just all we had was Jesus claiming to be Kyrios, it doesn't get you there. Then the other part is a lot of people point to forgiveness of sins, and only God can forgive sins. But, as he says, that could just be shown that he has been granted authority. And the fact that right here, you have 1,000 red flags up already, it kills me, because I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a little. I'm going to thump my hobby horse, and I'm going to offend people. So this is me speaking, not Than. Than is he's not associated with me. So the thing is, like, this is actually what drives me nuts. When again, Christians, I feel like half the time are not educated enough to sometimes have even some of these conversations, because they don't realize what a good argument is versus a bad argument, and that is actually showing that we're not loving God with all our mind. And it kills me, because when a good argument is actually being laid out, and this is why epistemology is actually really useful, you recognize it and you go, ooh, that's actually really hard to explain away. Like, you could explain kyrios, you could explain away, as he just did, the forgiveness of sins. It's a lot harder to explain away Cloud Rider motif when it's attached to Bel and when it's attached to Zeus. And people don't realize that is actually a very strong claim to deity. Yes. So it just kills me, where I'm like, Christians, what are we doing? Like, sometimes I think it's because it's not the standard, almost like mainstream evangelical fundamentalist kind of like argumentation being used, but it's a bit more sophisticated, and because it's taking cultural context into account and arguing from the context. Sorry. Any thoughts on my tangent there? I apologize.
No, that matches my experience for the most part, to be honest with you. I am, and it matches, and that lines up with what you see here when he brings up the standard apologetic arguments, and I go, yeah, this isn't one of those arguments. I agree with you, because I'm saying, yeah, those don't linchpin anything. Like, they can be part of a cumulative case, all this other stuff. But when I said I agree with him that I don't think those arguments are as strong as people think. but so, like, in their defense, I get it. But also, if you hear somebody saying, hey, I agree with you, it's not one of those types of arguments, this is better, just be patient.
Yeah, it's like, just chill for a minute, let the boy cook. Because that's how I feel like when sometimes I even like at youth group, like, so I'll say something and then they're like hold on, let me finish. And then when I finish, like, oh that's a good point. I'm like, yeah, just breathe, it's okay. All right, I'll go ahead and we'll watch this interaction, because I thought this interaction went better than the first one, because the first one, there was a lot of things were moving so fast. Yeah. And then on top of that, I don't think you got voted out before any real meat could be brought to the conversation. Because essentially it's like acknowledging signposts as you guys were like flying through it. So I think this one goes a lot better.
Well, that's a really good way of putting it. Like, and I think Alex would probably endorse what I'm about to say, which is, because a lot of people are like looking at that first resurrection interaction and going like, my gosh, he like kept on interrupting him and all this other stuff. But I'm willing to bet if you were to ask Alex, he'd probably agree with me if I said something like this. No, that conversation was him and I both acknowledging the time constraints and the external pressures, and just both like through eye contact, physical like stuff, tone, and just a few phrases. Like, we know, like you said, signposting. We're signposting to each other that we know what the other person's going to say. But this topic, they're kind of going back and forth, and we're doing a really fast. It's almost like if you're watching anime, it looks like the two fighters like aren't even moving, but like they've exchanged like 300 blows in a matter of seconds. That's what happened.
That's exactly it. Yes, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Because that was kind of my takeaway, and especially now talking to you in post of my original video, I'm like, I think that's actually probably what was happening there, because I originally had a real cynical view, where I was like, okay, Alex, come on, you have to deal with it. You have to deal with it. But then hearing your context and then watching it multiple times since, I'm like, that might be what's happening. It's more signposting. But again, my cynical side could get ahead of me. So, but all right, let's go ahead and watch the rest of this interaction.
This is an identification thing.
So where's Jesus claiming to be God?
That's where I'm going. So we have these puzzle pieces in place.
Sure.
If you fast forward to Mark's gospel, and I'm going to use Mark.
Let's do Mark.
Jesus before Caiaphas in Mark's gospel, Caiaphas asks him, who are you? And instead of just explicitly saying, I am God, Jesus quotes Daniel 7, saying he is the Son of Man, the human one, who will ride on the clouds, and calls himself the second power. So you have this two powers in heaven motif. The two powers, they're both God, and the Cloud Rider motif, and the Son of Man. He's quoting Daniel 7 to identify himself. After that, Caiaphas tears his robe and cries blasphemy.
I do think that Jesus is making some pretty extraordinary claims.
why would you raise a flag to that? Like, sorry, I was all like when I first watched this, I was like, Brett, like, he just laid out a case. I was like, nah, man. Sorry.
I mean, to be fair, to be fair, like you've heard the argument before, and so you see all the interconnected puzzle pieces coming together really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I'm like giving a lecture, it takes a while. Like, and this happens every single time. If I lecture on this topic, every single time you see people kind of like do that, and like and you just see like randomly throughout the lecture, people will be like, "Oh, I get it," and like one of those weird arguments.
Moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and this was actually a killer argument, because if people aren't familiar with the Cloud Rider motif, the Bible continually does what we call polemics, which is like, you could say a polite mockery or reversal of what the pagan cultures would do. So, the Genesis 6 does a good job with this. Like, you have the Assyrian legends of the flood, and really the gods flooded the world because they were annoyed with loud people, so they kill them. And then Genesis 6 comes along and is like, actually, no, that's not why God flooded the earth. It's actually because it was wicked and evil and became corrupted. And so there's polemics there. And then what they'll also do is they'll take titles from others. And one of them is He Who Rides on the Clouds, which is given to Baal, and who is one of course, the top deities of the ancient Near Eastern pagan Canaanite pantheon, whatever. And then same thing with Zeus, and you really see also like in the book of Revelation when it talks about like lightning is in his eyes and stuff like that. It's like clearly pointing to Zeus, who is the king of all the gods. Yeah. So he is that guy, and he's connecting it, saying he's stronger than that guy, he's better than that guy, but connecting those motifs with that as being polemical against paganism. Even with the temple practices, a lot of people look at the temple practices of Egypt and then see how the temple practices worked in Israel and go, see, they're the same, they're so similar, Israel stole from them, as opposed to seeing the way the Bible continually does it, which is actually, no, this is a corrective against it. Yeah. So it's like kind of like you're kind of on the right track, but you got to flip it. Yeah, because that's kind of what they're doing. So yeah. All right. Anything else you wanted to add there?
No, because we didn't really get into his response yet. Okay. I wanted once the interaction's over, maybe I want to hear what your read is there.
Okay, cool.
Claims of himself, such as being the Son of Man, but I still don't see why he's claiming to be God. If this was the way that he was trying to reveal his divinity to people, it'd be a strange and convoluted way to do it. Psalm 82 also talks about God presiding over a council of gods, saying, "You shall be called gods." I think there's a mistake here. And Jesus quotes that psalm when he's referring to his relationship with the Father
I understand what you're
in the Gospel of John. So even if in the Old Testament you have these sort of lesser gods, right? Jesus is only claiming to be that.
Right? That this is not a Christological implication, and I have mine. And I get what you're saying, where you're coming from. But to the ancient author, how obvious would this be?
So the best we have here is Jesus claiming to be the Son of Man, and that might indicate that he might be God.
Yeah, well, we don't predicate our hypotheses on the evidence we wish we did have. We go off the evidence that we do have.
That's right. And I don't think that there's any point at which Jesus says...
So you're saying that this is not... What? Did you see Tim in the background going like...
Oh, no, I didn't see that. Like, that's right, get him. And it's about ready to end. I think. Let me just see if there's anything else. Hold on.
All right, guys, that's time.
That's it.
Evidence not good enough. It's so nice. Sorry, I've got more time. I wish we could.
He's so polite. Anyway, so here's, my take on this is right when he goes, well, all we have is that he claims himself to be the Son of Man, and that's the best we got. That's saying that it might be alluding to. And this is where I said in my video, and I know I upset some atheists. I said in my videos, like, I don't think I always really like Alex O'Connor. I think he's a really nice guy. But then I said, I'm almost past the point of where I could take him as a real serious thinker. And I know that got me really in trouble with some people. And the reason for that is because this is like outright pigeonholing.
Yeah.
It's going, I expect if someone's claiming to be God, they need to say, I am God, as opposed to what we see what Jesus does all throughout his ministry, which is speaking around everything that what he did. Like, that's what the parables were. He didn't just come right out half the time and be like, you know what? You're supposed to love your neighbor freely. No, instead, he tells an entire story about a guy who owes his master lots of money, and the master let him go, but then he gets mad at the same guy who was forgiven, goes to another servant and demands he's paid. What we see Jesus do this all the time, where he speaks around something to convey the point. But when he says, I am the Son of Man, the ancient writer, that's why Caiaphas ripped his robe and said blasphemy. That makes zero sense if he's just like, I'm a Messiah figure. They were waiting for a Messiah. It wasn't blasphemy.
We also had multiple Messiahs around this time.
Exactly. There's a lot of people claiming to be Messiah, and none of them were called blasphemous. In fact, they gained their own followers.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they'd be squashed or killed. And actually there's a Messiah figure, I forget his name, that was brought up like after Christ arose and Christianity was established. Yeah. And it's actually kind of what caused a big division between Judaism and Christianity, because they're like, we got a Messiah. And the Christians were like, he rose from the dead.
It's not only that. You'll notice in my argument, I actually specifically even say Son of Man just means the human one. Like that's the literal translation, right?
Yeah.
And the point I'm trying to make here is in Daniel 7, you have a lot of moving pieces once you have the context, which is you have the Son of Man, who is the human one, who is the second power and is the Cloud Rider. So these three things going on with this one individual. He's human, Cloud Rider, which is God, and a second power, which is God. That is what Jesus is claiming to be. It's not, and so Alex hyper focuses right on the Son of Man motif in that passage, but then ignores the Cloud Rider and second power aspects,
which is exactly why I had my beef that got me in trouble. But I was like, this is a weird hill that a lot of atheists I've noticed will die on, and even like Unitarians and others, because they want it to be outrightly spoken.
Yeah, and I have an explanation for that.
That's not how we do thinking. Anyway,
and I have an explanation to that. Part of that explanation is what you said, where Jesus speaks around things. That's just the pattern that Jesus speaks in. But then also you have the messianic secret motifs in the Gospels, right? Well, if you take a divine counsel approach to the Bible, I think that makes tons of sense.
Yes.
Right? Because Jesus isn't going to, there's also all these other times where Jesus says, it is not yet my time. Don't say anything to anybody about who I am, yada, yada, yada. It's not just because of the human authorities that Jesus is keeping his identity a secret from. It's also the principalities and powers who he is here to defeat, that he's engaging in this epistemic warfare, if you want to call it that.
Right. Which is why he also, when the time comes, I mean, he straight up like, okay, Satan entered into him, and he's just like, what you're going to do quickly. Because now he's acknowledging, now's the time. I've revealed who I am, and this is going to go down.
And so if Jesus thought, right, like he probably did in the Second Temple period, that there's a rebelling Elohim and all this other stuff and blah, 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 blah. Well, of course, he's not going to just be like, yeah, I am Yahweh incarnate, right? The whole entire point is to subtly signpost to who he is and what's going on in such a way that it's not completely explicit. But also, again, why even expect that? Like, why, if Jesus was God incarnate, why would you expect the words, I am God, to come out of his mouth? Because analogously, if I'm in the grocery store with my kids and I tell my kids, hey, stop messing around or you're going to be grounded or whatever, right? Well, that's enough for you to be like, yeah, he clearly thinks and is acting on the presumption that he is those kids' father.
Right. Right.
Do you need me to pull Darth Vader and I am your father? No, like what is up with the inconsistent standards here? It's ridiculous.
No, it is ridiculous, and that's why it's weird, because in my mind, like, for an atheist, especially atheists, I'm like, there's no ground lost on just saying like, okay, he claimed to be God, but the guy was loony. Like, you know, they could just, I mean, that's, as an atheist, I'd be like, yeah, it's clear if you read the ancient literature and the motifs, there's definitely a deity being claimed, but it doesn't mean I have to worship him, because that's why Jesus mythicists, like, as well, I can't take seriously, because Jesus is like the most documented, like, ancient figure basically that we have. So in my mind, I'm like, there's no sense in denying it. The question isn't, did Jesus exist? The question really is he who he claimed to be? That's really where the question comes down to.
I actually just really don't get it at the end of the day too, because like the charitable interpretation, right, is the whole, well, they really just don't think that this happened, right? But here's the thing, man, like, this is not an endorsement of Unitarianism or any kind of low Christology. Just saying that from the outside. This is not an endorsement.
Acknowledged.
But also, what's at stake? Like, at the end of the day, if I am wrong about Trinitarian creedal Christianity, where Jesus is God the Son incarnate, I'm still worshiping Jesus, and I'm still going to live my life as a Christian, albeit just not what people would call creedal Christianity anymore, right? Like, that's all that's at stake here at the end of the day. Like, it doesn't make atheism more likely. It doesn't like make it doesn't make Christianity as a whole system less likely.
Right.
So again, not an endorsement of Unitarianism or anything like that.
Right.
All I'm saying is this isn't a silver bullet that people act like it is.
Right, because it's like, well, if that's the case, that still wouldn't shift my thought of him rising from the dead. If you were able to debunk that Jesus did never claim to be God, then I would just be like, okay, so I guess Unitarians or Arians or somebody else is right all along, and we really were wrong in creedal Christianity, which I don't think is true.
Or creedal Christianity is still true. You're like, because here's the point I'm trying to make here. Even if Jesus never did claim to be God, what does not follow out of that is the negation of creedal Christianity.
That's also true, because then we have to deal with the apostles and the disciples of the apostles who clearly claimed he was God. So it's like, if these people are claiming no evidence,
let's just take away all the evidence for like high Christology and Trinitarian theology, and all we have is church tradition, right? That's still not equal to the negation of creedal Christianity.
True.
That's the point I'm trying to make here. It's just like, you need to give a positive case for Unitarian and non-incarnational theology. What is the evidence for the proposition God is not Trinitarian and God did not become incarnate? That is a very different claim than saying there's not enough evidence to. You get the point.
Yeah, and my point with atheists, when they go after like I'm like, okay, let's say you completely debunk that Jesus is deity. Okay, that's again not the silver bullet you think it is. As far as did Jesus rise from the dead, it would just simply mean that, oh, well, then this group has been correct the whole time. It doesn't. Again, it's not the silver bullet. You have to debunk theistic arguments. You have to debunk eyewitness testimonies to the resurrection. These are the things that you have to actually deal with before. I mean, these are other theological things, but the point of Christianity is that Jesus rose from the dead.
Yes,
so
exactly.
And that God is true. So that's kind of where I'm always just like, I don't know why people will argue that, because they're like, well, this. I'm like, even if I granted that, it doesn't prove that Jesus didn't rise from the dead or God doesn't exist. It would just mean that creedal Christians have been wrong, which I don't think is remotely the case. I actually think we have a pretty robust, the cloud rider motif is one of many, but I think the Gospel of John makes it very clear, which I know people say is written later, so you can't trust it, but I just think that's just bad methodology. You have Revelation, which even if you took a late date writing of that, it has probably the highest Christology of all the books. So we could keep going. And Paul in Romans chapter 9 calls Jesus God outright. Titus 2:13. We could keep going and going and going and going, where it's like, okay, so you're telling me the direct disciples, the apostles, believe Jesus was God, but they're just wrong. Like it's a weird thing for me, and this is why I have a hard time taking anyone seriously who makes this sort of argumentation, because there's so many data points. As we talked about, there's data points. Once you connect them, you have to go with inference to the best explanation, and the inference to the best explanation is with Caiaphas right there, as you pointed out, with the cloud rider motif and the Son of Man, is that Jesus made a claim to deity that was very clear, enough to make the Caiaphas actually call him a blasphemer, and then the direct disciples all claiming him to be God.
Yep.
That seems a pretty close cut case. And my favorite part is when you read the Gospel of John, because it was written later. My favorite part is like the little parenthetical phrases he uses it throughout, where it's just like, and he said this referring to his death, but we didn't know because we just didn't know.
We're silly gooses. That's why.
That's like, we just missed the forest for the trees. That's all. Haha.
Yeah.
Which I actually think is, again, to the case of Maxwell data, that also points to data points of embarrassment. Yeah, because it's like, if you're trying to make up this religion and this cult, you wouldn't be probably including the
Yeah,
fact that
if
we
I'm gonna
kept
make up a
missing.
religion. I'm gonna be like, hey, you're all my follow me, but also guys, by the way, like your wives, they're my wives now.
Yeah. Like, right. And that's like what they would do, especially back then. And here it's like, no, we didn't do that. In fact, we probably, most of us probably died for it. And then also the fact that they like include all these embarrassing details about
Yeah.
themselves. It's just so funny. Like Peter, who is the early, like one of the greatest church leaders, right?
Yep.
Like all throughout the gospel events is the idiot, like who always says he speaks out of turn. He's always the one who's brash compared to everyone else. Anyway, you know this stuff. It's just one of those. I'm like, people don't just include that stuff if they're trying to make everyone look good. They start the same. But anyway, that's all part of it.
Oh no, 100%.
So anyway, that's why when I was watching, I got the minimal facts thing and how what was happening there. The more I watched it, but the still, when it comes to the deity of Christ, I have a real hard time taking people seriously who will not acknowledge all the little data points. And that's my personal thing. Doesn't mean that's yours. You're very charitable, and I really appreciate that. Actually, about you is something I could probably take on myself. But that's also probably why you're doing this more on the front lines, because you actually specialize more in this particular area. I feel like.
Look, man. I'm just, man, this is gonna sound super Christianese. I'm just kind of doing what I think the Lord is like trying to tell me to do. Because here's the other flip side too, right? Maybe what we need on the front lines is somebody that is more rhetorically able than me. Who knows? Like, I don't know.
God uses different people. Like,
what? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because I mean, I've had it where certain people are just really, if someone's very warm and welcoming, that person leads them to the Lord. I've led people to the Lord by straight up like destroying them and like being blunt and just wrecking them because they were like got really aggressive. Then I just like turned the kill switch on and went for it. And we went round and round and round. There's one particular individual I could think of went round and round and round. I mean, for days and back and forth. And the individual converted. And it was like, yeah, because basically you kept beating down my wall, and every time I thought I could take you down, it didn't. And I just started realizing I'm fighting a losing battle because the facts are clearly lined up over here.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, and I'm that person. I'm the person who needs to be punched in the face before I'll listen to you, because I have my data points, and you need to knock them down. It's on you to prove me wrong. And I have that mentality. So God uses different people, and I think it's really important. But I do like your the fact that you actually do have a really good demeanor and you're very gracious. But you're also, it's because you understand the arguments that are being had, and that helps because the more you understand your opponent, the less angry you tend to get.
Yeah,
you can actually understand
my biggest weakness. My biggest weakness, which I found out is tied to like my high spectrum ADHD, is just my impatience. That's like probably my biggest weakness, because like, look, if I know the argument you're about to give and you're talking for like 10 seconds, I mean, dude, I can't even sit in lines. Like at a family function, when people are getting in line to get the food, I do not wait in a line because I'm like losing my mind.
Yes.
People interpret that as me trying to be chivalrous and respectful. No, it's literally, I just can't sit in lines. That's the thing I always have been trying to like work on.
Patience is the same here. Patience is not my strong suit, but that's also not to say like, I should clarify this. It doesn't mean I railroad everybody, by the way. If someone actually is legitimate and they're being like honest seeking, I love having a nice calm conversation. But if somebody comes at me, I have no problem being like, okay, now's the time.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's the thing. Same here. At my impatience, I tend to want to speak a lot and speak quickly. But it's also because I think you and I both have a bit of a high spectrum ADHD situation going on.
Yeah, 100%.
So anyway, so Than, what was your overall thought and impression on this? Yeah, your camera went out.
There we go. We're good.
What was your overall impression of your entire experience with Jubilee? Speaking with Alex, what was your impression of Alex? How did you think the whole thing went? What did you think you did really, really well? What parts did you think you did poorly? Just give us an honest review of yourself.
Yeah, like I said, I really liked working with Jubilee. The format was really difficult, but I also knew what I was getting myself into. So I'm not going to sit here and complain about the format. I wish I had more opportunities to talk with Alex, not just in the Jubilee thing, but also just in general. Like, I'd love to have, whether it's like a formal debate or just like an open discussion on a podcast about a topic with Alex. Like, I'd love to do that. If there's like no time limit, by that I mean like if we can talk for like 2 hours, that'd be great, man. Like, we can dig into the weeds. My overall impression with Alex is I liked him, like, because
he's very likable.
After everything was done and we got done recording and everything, we went out to the bar and had some drinks and ate together. I was like dying because I was sick, but I was like, I'm fine. I didn't drink because I was sick, but I was eating a bunch of food. And we had a fun conversation, like, and we were able to actually dig into the weeds with a lot of stuff and all that jazz. So I really liked Alex. Yeah. My overall impression about how I did, man, I mid to use modern parlance. But I say, okay, so like on a substance level, I think I was doing really well. Substance level. So if you remove the rhetoric, the shades of rhetoric, and you remove the time pressures, I feel like anybody that knew the dialectic and knew the arguments and knows the data would sit there and hear what was happening, especially like even during the resurrection and Christology stuff, and be like, yeah, Than knows his stuff. Alex is in trouble. Now add in the rhetoric and all that stuff. I don't think I did that well on that end. And I'm fine admitting that.
Well, there's a difference between rhetoric and substance. I mean, some people, and I think there's a place for both. In our little nerdy world that you and I reside in, there is actually a weird, there's like a weird taboo against rhetoric. I'll hear people say like, oh, they just use rhetoric all the time. And now certain people are almost all rhetoric. Yeah. I've interacted with different individuals. I don't want to pull you into my problems, but like Dr. James White has interacted with me, and there was a lot of rhetoric that was thrown. And I was like, well, you didn't really deal with the core of my argument though. And that's when it struck me. I was like, okay, this is purely rhetorical. But if you have data points with rhetoric, it makes a very strong case, because the rhetoric communicates to people on a different level than the data points. But if your rhetoric backs up your data points, then you're doing real solid. But certain people are better being rhetoricians than others. Matt Dillahunty is somebody I would say is a really good rhetorician. Yeah. And that there is a place that people actually tend to be persuaded a lot by rhetoric, which much to my chagrin, but it is it's the reality. I know.
That's why I'm working on rhetoric slowly but surely. I've come to realize I need to do that. So what
you got to do is you got to get involved in your local youth ministry. And get on the team. Okay, good. Get more involved and just start roasting the teenagers, and then they'll start roasting you, and then your rhetoric skills will keep increasing. And then you'll get really good at it.
Here's the disconnect, Will. When I'm with the homies, the roasts are crazy. Like, it's bad. It's just transferring. It's like there's like this weird disconnect in my brain where it's like I have this part of my brain, I don't know where it would be, right? Like, but like this part of my brain is like all the substance and stuff I know, and over here is like roasting the homies, but there's like a 50 millimeter steel wall between the two.
That's fine. It just means that you're like, okay, I work hard or I play hard. That's like that's your thing. It's fine. Yeah. No, that's fun. So I actually love it. I think what you do is I thought you performed very well under the time constraints. I thought the first interaction did not go. I think that one was the mid. I'll give you more than a mid on that other one, because I think the argument that you laid out was actually solid. And it was funny, I actually got tagged in a post, and a few people commented about it around when I did my video, because I discussed that a little bit more in depth in my previous video about the cloud writer motif. And people like, oh my gosh, props to the church split. I was like for telling me this. I was like, it was Than said this, and I'm just like riffing, but okay, I'll take the credit, I guess, because that's what you did in this. Because it was like this, I watched this video, and anyway, and I was like, that right there was, I thought was like, if you are familiar with that data point, I was blown away that you brought it up. I bring up the cloud writer motif in my book, but it's not something I see a lot of people bring up as a whole. And if you understand that argument and you see that motif all throughout the Tanakh, it is very difficult for someone to get past high Christology.
If you're really into that kind of stuff, I also have a Markan Christology series that is, if you think that's dorky, the Cloud Rider motif one is dorky, it's going to take a while because I have like 8 videos that are all like over an hour long on that series. But I connect the dots between like the Chaos Conf motifs, the Feast of Booth, like the route that the Ark of the Covenant would take to go to the Temple Ascension, all this other stuff. And I connect a lot of dots for Mark's Christology in ways that 99% of people probably have not heard before.
Which is awesome. And so actually, Than, since we're kind of at the end of this and we've kind of reviewed that, where can people find more of your work? Because I think now that the people have heard, I mentioned in my previous videos, like I've listened to Than before. He's extremely sophisticated, but of course you're under time constraints. So people who might listen to this like, oh my gosh, I actually really like the data that he's bringing up and the discussions. And because I'm mostly a theology channel, because that's my degree, that's my studying, even though I love apologetics and exactly what you're doing. And there's a heart I have for it, but that I do theological apologetics primarily because that's my wheelhouse. Yeah. That's where I live. So where can people find your stuff?
Yeah, so weird question because I'm in the middle of a transition kind of right now.
Yep.
All of my work previous to now, you can find on the YouTube channel Exploring Reality. Black logo with a black background with like a red and white ER. That's where you can find a lot of my work. It's really, most of it's really dense. So it's not like the kind of videos that you watch while you're doing the dishes or something like that. Unless you can pay attention to it while you do that. I'm not one of those people. Moving forward, though, Mike and I from Inspiring Philosophy are kind of like joining forces, and my work moving forward is going to be posted primarily on that channel. If I have like a special heart project that I'm working on that is not going to get posted on Inspiring Philosophy because it's just like way too dense, I'll still post it to Exploring Reality. So like, for instance, I have an upcoming video on Inspiring Philosophy talking about Paul's 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul actually talks about the resurrection body. And I'm actually connecting it to like Deuteronomy and like highlighting a lot of really cool stuff that I think a lot of people might miss when they're just kind of reading the Bible casually and not connecting all the dots in the dorky ways that Will and I do. So
it's okay. It's my obsession. It's my hobby that's just out of control. But
yes,
so you'll be working actually directly with Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones, and Michael Jones. No one's a stranger to who he is. He's kind of, many people know he's kind of the GOAT in many areas. So he's one of those people that got into this game at what best time to get into it, and he's very knowledgeable. He's one of my favorite times with him ever was him debating the Muslim about child marriage.
Yeah,
it was absolutely a train wreck for the Muslim. And so anyway, so you can find Than's stuff on Exploring Reality, his own personal YouTube channel, and also on Inspiring Philosophy with Michael Jones. And Than clearly knows his stuff. He is probably one of the most skilled autodidacts I have encountered, and you are continuing on that. So I appreciate that. I appreciate your work. I know it's a huge help to the body of Christ. I think this actually, the apologetic works, I have a big passion, even though I call it the church split, for unity in the body. Even if I think I can have a very strong disagreement, I can have a very heated argument with you in my church lobby, and then afterwards go, he's my brother, don't mess with him, I love him.
Yeah.
Like, we can have those things, we can wrestle things deeply and passionately and intensely and still walk away brothers. That's a big thing for the church split. Now, that also means that I want unity in churches. The coolest part about apologetics is that we can all get on board with the data. We can have disagreements on theology, but we can go, but that's about Jesus rising from the dead. So I love it.
That's one of the things I really like to do as well, by the way. I don't know, people typically miss this, but a lot of my methodology is extremely irenic. I don't talk about what kind of church I go to or my theology lands most of the time because I don't want that stuff getting in the way. But my methodology is really irenic, and I kind of call it like a choose your own path apologetic, where I kind of just lay out the groundwork principles and then say, hey, if this is what you think about XYZ, this is how you go about things. If you think this is how you go about things this way, kind of a thing. And I try to make my work as irenic as possible, not defending my own particular beliefs.
That's usually how I teach even here at church. My own platform, like, hey, here's my view of hell. Hey, here's my view of the atonement. Here's my view. Like, this is mine, and I think these are the problems of the other views. But I would much rather someone disagree with me on theology and be a Christian than otherwise.
Yes, exactly, 100%.
I'd rather someone. I'm not Calvinist. I'm not a Reformed person, but I'd much rather someone be Reformed and Calvinist than not a Christian. So I'd rather disagree with my brothers and high five them and love them afterwards. So anyway, all right, well guys, go check out Exploring Reality and of course Inspiring Philosophy. If you're here, you definitely know Inspiring Philosophy, because I'm nothing in comparison. But Than, I really appreciate your time and also your patience as you dealt with some of my technical difficulties on my end. That was a whole backstory for some of you guys. I'll explain in the comments below. But guys, I do want to thank you for tuning into this. What did you think of the 21 Christians versus Alex O'Connor? How do you think Than performed? Be nice. And
no, don't hold back. I want. I'm not a teddy bear.
Never mind. Roast him
Roast
in the
me.
comments
If
below.
you think I did horrible, roast me. You will offend me more if you cushion your words against me rather than just telling me what you really think.
Okay, well, you heard it here, folks. So I had a thing now before we close up. I had a thing when I'd tell people, if you're going to leave me a 1-star review on like Apple Podcasts or something, you got to roast me. That was the rule. Like, you had to like. And then what had started happening is people started leaving me 5-star reviews and still roasting me.
Nice.
So my whole community is a bunch of jerks, is what I'm trying to say. Like, so everyone who hangs out of the church,
Bring it on, man.
So
I'll fight you.
Just like, it'll be fine. All right, guys. Well, thank you for tuning into the Church Split. I hope this was encouraging for you. I hope you learned something while listening to this today. And take care, God bless, and may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ dwell with you all richly. We'll see you in the next one. Take care.